World War I was an international brutal conflict between 1914 and 1918. Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire, also called the Central Powers, fought against Great Britain, France, Russia, Italy, Romania, Japan, and the United States, which are the Allied powers. Thanks to new military technologies and the horrors of trench warfare, World War I saw unprecedented levels of carnage and destruction. It ended with the defeat of the Central Powers and the death of more than 16 million people throughout Europe and the world. Tensions had been growing throughout Europe following Germany's unification and annexation of French territories after the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. Germany's rise upset the European balance of powers and led to a game of alliances. The spark was struck in Bosnia, where the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire was killed by a Serbian nationalist struggling to end Austro-Hungarian rule over Bosnia. Austria-Hungary, supported by Germany, blamed the Serbian government for the attack and declared war on Serbia, which was backed by Russia, allied to France. Within a week, World War I unfolded. Germany's strategy, known as the Schlieffen Plan, was for a war on two fronts against France and Russia. The plan was to rapidly concentrate the bulk of its army in the west to defeat France first, then shift forces to the east before Russia could fully mobilize. In Asia, Japan sided with Britain, seizing German colonies in China and the Pacific. The Ottoman Empire, historic enemy of the Russian Empire, entered the war on the side of Austria-Hungary and Germany, opening fronts in the Middle East for controlling access to oil and the Suez Canal. The German advance penetrated deep into France, closing in on Paris, but was halted at the Battle of the Marne by Franco-British forces. The defeat meant the end of German plans for a quick victory in France. Both sides dug into trenches, and the Western Front was the setting for a 3 years long war of attrition that saw the first use of chemical weapons and gases. Important World War I battles include Verdun and the Battle of the Somme on the Western Front, and the huge naval battle of Jutland between the German and British fleets in 1916. The recent invention of aviation was first used for observations, then planes were gradually used for bombing and air combat. Around the world, European colonies and British dominions such as India engaged in war. From 1914 to 1916, Russia's army mounted several offensives on the Eastern Front, but was unable to break through the German lines. To support geographically isolated Russia, Allied forces tried to open a sea supply route via the Dardanelles Strait, and then later launched a land invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula. Both campaigns failed against Ottoman resistance. Italy, which was initially part of the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary, had stayed neutral until 1915, as it turned against Austria-Hungary to annex new territories. The 12 Italian offensives along the Isonzo River yielded little result. Aspiring to recover Balkan territories, Bulgaria joined the Central Powers in invading Serbia. In the seas, the Royal Navy imposed a naval blockade on Germany, while German submarines were used to sink military and commercial ships supplying the Allies, including those coming from the US. In addition, Britain intercepted and transmitted a German telegram to Mexico offering an alliance against the United States, which decided to go to war in 1917. Russia's lack of advances on the battlefield and economic instability exploded in the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, which ended Russian involvement in World War I and later led to the creation of the Soviet Union. Although Russia was out of the game and Germany was able to focus on the Western Front, it was unable to achieve quick victory against the Allies before the arrival of US troops. Despite the Ottoman victory at Gallipoli, later defeats and an Arab revolt backed by the British forced the Turks to sign a treaty with the Allies in October 1918. Moreover, Austria-Hungary, dissolving from within due to growing nationalist movements among its diverse population, reached an armistice. Facing dwindling resources on the battlefield and the surrender of its allies, Germany was finally forced to seek an armistice in November 1918, ending World War I. World War I helped spread a severe pandemic called the Spanish flu, strengthened America's economic status, and led to the fall of four large empires. The German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman empires were dismantled as nations were created, including Poland, Finland, Turkey, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. Germany was forced to cut down its army and pay heavy war reparations, as it was considered the sole responsible for war damages by the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty was considered a humiliation by the German people and laid the groundwork for World War II. despite the creation of the League of Nations that aimed at promoting peace.
World War II was a global conflict in which Germany, Italy, and Japan, called the Axis powers, fought against Britain, the Soviet Union, the US, and China from 1939 to 45. Coming to power in 1933, Hitler capitalized on the economic depression that had spread worldwide following the crash of Wall Street, as well as the German resentment of the humiliating Treaty of Versailles, signed after Germany's surrender in World War I. Declaring that the Germans were a superior race that needed living space, Lebensraum. Hitler began to rebuild the German military and broke the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Hoping to avoid war, France and Britain allowed Hitler to expand German territory unchecked by uniting with Austria and annexing the German-speaking areas of Czechoslovakia, Sudetenland, before invading the entire country. World War II erupted in Europe in September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland from the west before the Soviet invasion from the east. Britain and France responded by declaring war on Germany, but took little offensive action. In 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway to secure iron supply, followed shortly by successful attacks on Belgium, the Netherlands, and even France. All of these nations were conquered swiftly by mid-1940, thanks to the Blitzkrieg, the German offensive warfare using a rapid, overwhelming force concentration designed to achieve quick victory. The British Expeditionary Force was trapped at Dunkirk, but managed to withdraw by sea back to Britain. Later in the summer of 1940, Germany launched a further attack on Britain exclusively from the air, as the island nation was well protected by the mighty Royal Navy. Although the German Luftwaffe heavily bombed London during the Blitz and other British cities, it was never able to overcome Britain's Royal Air Force and resilience. Italy, led by fascist dictator Mussolini, an ally of Germany, expanded the war even further by invading parts of North Africa and launching an unsuccessful campaign in Greece. In 1941, Germany led the Axis powers against the Soviet Union in the largest surprise land invasion in history, called Operation Barbarossa. Behind the lines, millions of Jews and communists were exterminated in horrible killing factories. Hitler, who had hoped for a quick victory, initially made swift progress deep into the Russian heartland. However, the invasion of the USSR would prove to be the first major German setback, as the German forces, Wehrmacht, gradually got trapped in a war of attrition due to the country's sheer size, poor roads, brutal winters, and the Soviet scorched earth policy and resilience. In 1943, after the battles of Stalingrad and Kursk, Germany was forced into a full-scale retreat. In the Pacific, Japan, a new power that aimed to strengthen its dominant position in the region and acquire resources for its fast-growing population, seized Manchuria from China in 1931. In December 41, Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. Navy base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. America, which till then had been supporting Britain and imposing economic sanctions against Japan, officially joined the war against the Axis powers. Japan pursued its expansionist policy throughout the Southeast Asia-Pacific region and committed terrible war crimes, but its advances were halted in 1942 after losing the critical Battle of Midway against the U.S. Germany and Italy suffered a decisive defeat against the British at the Battle of Alamein in Egypt in 1942, which was a turning point of the North African campaign. In 43, after Mussolini's regime collapsed and the Allies landing in Sicily, the Germans moved to quickly take control of Italy, fearing its loss to the Allies. On the Eastern Front, the Soviets became the unlikely allies of the Americans, and the British gradually pursued the Germans across Eastern Europe. In June 1944, American, British, and Canadian forces launched the D-Day invasion, the largest seaborne invasion in history, on the coast of Normandy to begin the liberation of German-occupied France. The Allies also continued the strategic bombing campaign on German cities. Allied forces were closing in on Germany from both fronts, east and west, until May 1945, when Germany surrendered after the Soviets' invasion of Berlin and Hitler's suicide. By spring 45, most of Japan's conquests had been liberated, and Allied forces were closing in on the Japanese home islands. Following the bombing campaigns against Japanese cities and Japan's refusal to surrender, the U.S. dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Faced also with the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, Japan surrendered in September 1945. World War II was the bloodiest and largest conflict in history, with about 60 million deaths worldwide, many of whom from the Soviet Union and China, as well as Jews exterminated during the Holocaust. The United Nations was created and a sense of political and economic integration began, especially in Europe, to forge a sense of common identity. The influence of European great powers waned, triggering the decolonization of Africa and Asia, and setting the stage for the emergence of the US and the Soviet Union as new rival superpowers to confront in a Cold War.
At the end of the Second World War, the Cold War had begun. The world lay divided between 2 great superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. It would not be a conventional war, with the 2 sides never directly fighting. Instead, it would be an ideological battle between communism and capitalism, the East versus the West, and the resulting struggle for ideological influence and power. Both sides would stockpile nuclear weapons, with questions over how to use, control, and eliminate them becoming central to the conflict. From Stalin to Reagan, from the arms race to the Cuban Missile Crisis, from the Berlin Wall to Vietnam and Korea, this is the story of the Cold War. At the end of the Second World War, Europe lay divided between 2 camps. The Soviet Union, the world's leading communist power, would rule over what would become known as the Eastern Bloc. After suffering almost 27 million casualties during the war, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin had been keen to create a buffer zone against the West, installing communist governments across Eastern Europe. As former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill would famously state, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. The United States, the world's leading capitalist power,
power, would also emerge as a post-war superpower. Their economy was thriving, and they had sole control of the most powerful weapon in human history, the atomic bomb, two of which President Harry Truman had dropped on Japan to end the war. Hostilities began when Stalin delayed the removal of Soviet troops from Iran and pressured Turkey into giving him control over the Turkish Straits. Wanting to stop Soviet expansionism, President Truman would announce the Truman Doctrine, sending military aid to Greece and Turkey. It was a policy aimed at containing the Soviet Union and would become the basis of American Cold War strategy for years to come. This policy was known as containment. Fearing the spread of communism in Europe, the United States would also introduce the Marshall Plan in April 1948. There was thought that by improving Europe's economies, communism would lose its appeal. The plan provided almost $13 billion of financial aid, encouraging economic integration and the promotion of free markets. Germany was one of the most prominent symbols of the newly divided world. Having been split in half after the war, the Soviets would occupy the east, with Britain, France and America occupying the west. Berlin, despite laying 100 miles within the Soviet zone, was divided in the same way. In June 1948, Stalin would begin the Berlin blockade, stopping all ground access to the city in an attempt to drive out the Americans, British and French. But Truman quickly responded, beginning the Berlin airlift, delivering supplies to the city for 15 months and forcing Stalin to end the blockade. With tensions high, the US and its allies would establish an independent West German state, the Federal Republic of Germany. The Soviets would respond the following month by creating the German Democratic Republic in the east. In response to Soviet expansion and influence, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was created in 1949, bringing together the US, Canada and most of Western Europe in a defensive pact against the Soviet Union. To help stop the spread of communism, the CIA would be established in September 1947, with the organization growing in size and strength over the coming years. From 1949 to 1952, CIA personnel would increase tenfold, with their overseas bases growing from 7 to 47, and their annual budget increasing from $4.7 million to $82 million. They would go on to interfere in developing countries, where independence movements were often seen as potential paths to communism. In 1953 and 54, they would overthrow the leaders of Iran and Guatemala, installing highly unpopular dictators in their place, earning the organization an infamous reputation. Events in East Asia would soon turn the Cold War into a global conflict. In China, Mao Zedong had led communist revolutionaries to victory in 1949, establishing the People's Republic of China. The US would respond by increasing economic support to its new ally Japan in an attempt to stimulate economic growth in the region, as well as sending aid to French colonial forces in Vietnam who were fighting against a communist independence movement led by Ho Chi Minh. In 1950, communist North Korea invaded South Korea. With domino theory at the height of political thought, the idea that if one nation fell to communism, others would as well, the United States sent tens of thousands of American troops to push the invaders back north. The Korean War would drag on for 3 years, with the armistice of July 1953 leaving it so there was no clear victory for either side. The border between the two Koreas had hardly shifted at all, with the loss of life totaling over 2 million. But crucially, the Korean War showed that communism could be contained, the main thinking behind future conflicts, in particular, Vietnam. After Stalin's death in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev had become leader, soon creating the Warsaw Pact to counter the growing power of NATO. But Khrushchev would soon prove to be a provocative and unpredictable leader. In November 1956, he would threaten Britain and France with rocket weapons after they invaded Egypt, and he was known for his emotional outbursts, allegedly banging his shoe on a table at the 1960 United Nations General Assembly. When a new president, John F. Kennedy, came to power in 1961, Khrushchev made an attempt to secure Berlin. There had been around 2.7 million defections from communist East Germany since 1949, most of which had escaped through West Berlin. Securing the city was therefore vital to the survival of the German Democratic Republic, with defections usually of the highly trained and educated growing by the day. At a 1961 meeting in Vienna, Khrushchev gave Kennedy 6 months to vacate Berlin, but Kennedy refused. Now desperate, Khrushchev authorized the construction of the Berlin Wall on August 12, 1961, creating a physical barrier between East and West Berlin. Starting as a barbed wire fence, it soon turned into a massive concrete block wall, 12 feet high and nearly 100 miles long, complete with armed guards and minefields. It was an embarrassment for communists everywhere. But Kennedy was having difficulties of his own. Cuba had been taken over by communist revolutionaries in early 1959. Led by Fidel Castro, the revolutionaries began freeing Cuba of its economic and political reliance on the US, eventually turning to the Soviet Union for help. Not wanting a communist nation so close to home, Kennedy attempted to topple Castro from power in the Bay of Pigs invasion, using a group of CIA-trained Cuban exiles. But it would turn out to be a disaster, with the invaders surrendering after just 3 days. It was an embarrassment to Kennedy and convinced Khrushchev that he needed to protect Castro, with him sending nuclear missiles to the island in 1962. American reconnaissance aircraft soon spotted the missiles, causing Kennedy to begin a naval blockade of Cuba to prevent any further Soviet shipments from arriving. 140,000 US invasion troops were then stationed in Florida, and the US alert system was raised to DEFCON 2 for the first time in history. They were preparing for nuclear war. As negotiations were underway, a confrontation in the Atlantic almost ended in disaster. US ships had used signaling depth charges to alert a Soviet submarine that it had strayed too close to the blockade. Thinking they were under attack, the submarine's captain ordered nuclear torpedoes to be launched, but the decision required the approval of all 3 onboard officers. One of the officers, Vasily Arkhipov, refused to go through with the launch, single-handedly preventing the outbreak of nuclear war. The very next day, on October 28th, Kennedy and Khrushchev were able to come to an agreement. Kennedy promised not to invade Cuba, and Khrushchev removed the Soviet missiles. It was the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war, and it significantly impacted the outlook of both powers, with a hotline being installed between the White House and the Kremlin to provide better communication if another crisis occurred. The next major crisis would occur in Vietnam, where the US had been supporting the South in their struggle against the Communist North for almost a decade. After Kennedy's assassination in 1963, his Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson was left to deal with Vietnam. Believing America would look weak on the international stage if he allowed the South to fall to communism, Johnson chose to rapidly increase US military involvement. But the war was deeply unpopular, and in 1968 protests would break out across the Western world. The largest would be seen in America, where a politicized youth demonstrated against a war they thought unjust and unwinnable. The scale of discontent proved too much for Johnson, who decided not to seek re-election. The war would last for another 5 years before the US decided to withdraw, with the Communist North then taking over the South. More than 58,000 Americans had died, as well as 250,000 South Vietnamese soldiers. Over 1 million North Vietnamese soldiers and Viet Cong guerrillas would also perish, as well as over 2 million civilians from both the North and the South, and thousands more from Laos and Cambodia. While containment had worked in Korea, it had proven ineffective in Vietnam. By 1964, the Soviet Union had been going through several internal difficulties. Khrushchev had been deposed and replaced by Leonid Brezhnev, whose reign was marked by nepotism, corruption, and economic stagnation. Standards standards of living within the Soviet sphere were deteriorating, and disillusionment was growing, with the Brezhnev Doctrine suppressing dissidents throughout the region with military force. This would lead Brezhnev to seek a more stable Soviet-American relationship. Facing large protests over Vietnam and Cambodia, President Richard Nixon was also looking to stabilize relations. In late 1969, he began talks with Brezhnev about a Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or SALT, which would freeze the existing number of intercontinental ballistic missiles on both sides. It was the beginning of a period of détente, a French term that refers to the easing of tensions between nations. Détente would lead to a tense but relatively stable decade, during which both sides would attempt to control their nuclear arsenals and avoid proxy conflicts, but it would ultimately prove unsuccessful. When Ronald Reagan assumed the presidency in 1981, the conventional wisdom of how to deal with the Soviet Union was falling apart. Détente was not working. In 1977, the Soviets had placed SS-20 ballistic missiles in Eastern Europe and had invaded Afghanistan in 1979. Fiery speeches would become a trademark of Reagan, with him describing the Soviet Union as an evil empire and declaring that democracy will leave Marxism-Leninism on the ash heap of history. But Reagan's view on nuclear weapons was clear. He wanted to see a world in which they did not exist, and where nations were free from the threat of total annihilation. The only way he saw to achieve this was to force the Soviets into a new arms race they would lose, pressuring them to accept an arms reduction agreement. As Reagan stated, their choice is to break their backs to keep up, or to agree to reductions. This policy would be called peace through strength. The cornerstone of this policy was the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI. Nicknamed Star Wars by the media, the project aimed at creating a radical new missile defense system, using lasers and space-based missile systems that could defend against a nuclear attack. Reagan knew that the Soviet Union was lagging far behind in computer technology and could never hope to match the program, leaving them dangerously exposed. This policy worked as predicted, with the Soviets soon forced to negotiate, meeting with the US in the 1985 summit to discuss the ongoing nuclear arms race. But this time, Reagan would meet with a new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, who would prove to be one of the most important figures of the entire Cold War. Facing years of economic stagnation and growing discontent in Eastern Europe, Gorbachev knew things had to change. He would introduce perestroika, or restructuring, to reform the economy, and glasnost, or transparency, to address corruption and political unrest. He knew that the arms race was crippling the Soviet economy, and that the only way forward was to negotiate with the United States. Gorbachev would meet with Reagan on 5 separate occasions between 1985 and 1988, with each meeting building trust and respect between the two. Reagan happily negotiated with such an open and cooperative Soviet leader, with the two signing the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty on December 8, 1987, banning all short and intermediate range missiles. Within 3 years, the treaty had led to the destruction of over 2,500 nuclear weapons, with each side allowing access to their nuclear sites to check compliance. It was a momentous agreement, being the first time both sides had pledged to eliminate an entire class of nuclear missile. But soon Gorbachev's reforms would begin to unravel the Soviet Union itself. In December 1988, he would make a speech to the United Nations, vowing to cut the Soviet ground force commitment in Eastern Europe by 500,000 men, signalling that the Brezhnev Doctrine would no longer be enforced. Realizing that they would not be crushed by the Soviet military, reformers began to emerge across Eastern Europe, and in 1989 a string of democratic revolutions would see nearly every communist government ousted from power. On November 9th, the most symbolic monument of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall, would come down, and Germany itself would be reunited the following year. The Soviet Union would collapse in 1991, dissolving into 15 independent states, a surprisingly quick and bloodless conclusion to the Cold War, a conflict which had dominated international relations for over 40 years.
calls and texts has literally never been easy.
The word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. But we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed.
Machiavelli is one of the greatest political philosophers of all time. His work, The Discorsi, would advocate for a self-governing republic and highlight that living under a monarch with absolute rule was akin to slavery, providing the political underpinnings for both the English and American revolutions. But Machiavelli's other work, The Prince, would have a far more sinister influence. A guidebook to rulers on how to gain and consolidate power, The Prince was considered so dangerous it was banned by the Catholic Church for more than 200 years. It has not only paved the way for tyrants, despots and dictators, but has had a profound impact on business, politics, religion, and the halls of power on every continent of the globe. But what did Machiavelli say? Who did he influence? And how has what a man wrote 500 years ago shaped the modern world in which we live today? From the White House to the Kremlin, from the Vatican to the Federal Reserve, this is how a man from Florence changed the course of history. This is how the writings of Niccolo Machiavelli are used to manipulate and control everyone. In 1469, Niccolo Machiavelli was born in Florence. The son of a lawyer, he was not born into a family of great wealth, nor one of poverty, but a family that prioritized a classical education, with Machiavelli being trained in what was known at the time as Studia Humanitatis, or in English, the studies of humanity. At the age of 7, he would begin learning Latin, followed by grammar, rhetoric, and poetry, with the education considered complete when one had learnt ancient history and moral philosophy. It was commonly believed that these subjects would best prepare someone for public life. As Cicero had once said, these disciplines nurture the values we principally need in order to serve our country well. And luckily for Machiavelli, that time would come sooner than expected. 500 years ago, Italy was not the same as it is today. It was not one unified country, but rather a collection of independent city-states, each with its own ruler and government. The Pope ruled Rome, the Medicis Florence, and the Sforza family Milan, all competing and waging war against each other for power and influence. It was in 1434 that the Medici family had established their rule over Florence, with their expertise in banking and commerce, transforming the city into an economic powerhouse.
See that?
1469, the same year Machiavelli was born, Lorenzo de' Medici came to power, with his family renowned for being keen financiers of Florentine culture, using their immense wealth to fund artists such as Michelangelo, Botticelli and Da Vinci. But although the Medicis were great patrons of the Italian Renaissance, Lorenzo was accused of being a tyrant whose greed, corruption and immorality defied the teachings of the Christian Church. He would later die in 1492, and just 2 years later, King Charles VIII of France invaded Italy. The Medici family, who had ruled Florence for 60 years, would now lose their grip on power, with the Florentine people supported by the French, driving them out of the city. Florence then established a great council, composed of thousands of men from the region's noble families. From these men, a small group were elected, and they, in turn, would appoint others to help run the city. The Florentine Republic was born. With many positions within the Republic needing to be filled, Machiavelli's name was put forward, with it being likely that his intelligence and drive were noticed by the Great Council. And so, in 1498, at the age of just 29, and with no prior diplomatic experience, Machiavelli was elected to Secretary of the Second Chancery, a position that had to coordinate all the correspondence and relations with regard to Florence's territorial possessions. Shortly afterwards, he was also appointed to Secretary to the Ten of War, the committee responsible for all the foreign and diplomatic relations of the Republic. In this position, Machiavelli could be called upon to travel on behalf of the Ten, negotiating with potential allies, gathering information, and aiding the Ten's ambassadors by writing up detailed reports on foreign affairs and sending them home to Florence. For the next 14 years, Machiavelli would be sent on various important missions across the European continent, where he would travel to numerous states, representing Florence's interests, and getting to see for himself how power really operated behind closed doors. For his first mission, Machiavelli would visit Caterina Sforza, the Countess of Imola and Forli, before being sent for 6 months to the court of Louis XII, the King of France. He was next sent to observe Cesare Borgia, the Duke of Romagna, and Captain General of the Papal Army, who, with the support of the French, would conquer large portions of northern Italy. In 1506, Machiavelli would visit the new Pope, Julius II, making extensive notes on his character and leadership, and a year later would be sent on his last mission,